Okay, everybody, in this section, we're going to be talking about direct democracy and how that works here in California. So let's go ahead and take a look. So first of all, we have to kind of ask ourselves, why do we look at California? Why do we study California? Obviously, we live here, right? Simple as that. California is the crossroads of America. When you think about it, we have every race, ethnicity, religion, orientation here in California. And it's kind of truly representative of the United States. Latinx people make up about 35% of the population, and 60% of that is of Mexican heritage. And there's a belief that by maybe 2030 or 2033, 2035, that Latinx people would be the majority here in California. So we're relatively young demographic. The mean age is about 35 years old. If California was its own country, it would be ranked within the top 10 economies in the world. We have a lot of migration into California. We have military bases, jobs, tech, that people move into California to be employed in. So 50% of Californians were born in California. And we have a population of about 39 million people, which is the largest population of a state in the country. So I'm going to go over a little bit where California has kind of evolved and been birthed throughout kind of our history. We first have our Spanish colonial period, which was from 1776 to 1821. The Spaniards wanted to fortify control in North America. European colonial powers began to construct fortifications to protect their settlements from foreign encroachment. The Spanish Empire had made several claims to California and sought to consolidate its position in, North America as a colonial power. Spaniards were in Mexico, even down into Central America and some parts of South America, and they also moved up into North America. Now, the Spanish and the Mexicans fought a war for independence. In 1821, Mexico gained their independence from Spain. September 15th, which is Mexican Independence Day. We have El Grito that happens in Mexico, where people, get together and at midnight they yell Viva Mexico. A lot of people might think that Independence Day is Cinco de Mayo, but that's not true. It is September 15th into the 16th, where Mexicans celebrate their independence. Following a successful revolt later that year, the colony won its freedom from Spain. Alta California, which encompasses present-day California, passed quietly into Mexican control. And during this time, we also started to see the migration of people who were moving out west into areas that kind of upset the Mexicans and were kind of looked at as a way to, as a way that their land is being encroached on by people moving out west. James Polk talked about something called the Manifest Destiny, where he believed that it was the United States' destiny to spread across the continent from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. American settlers, moved by huge numbers into California, being supported by indigenous tribes, and they revolted against the Mexican government. And the Mexican-American War marked the first U.S. armed conflict chiefly fought on foreign soil, and it pitted a politically divided and militarily unprepared Mexico against the expansionist-minded administration of James Polk in the United States, and far more advanced technology than what the Mexicans had, and really more kind of a one-sided fight, in that even though the Mexicans fought tough and hard, the war ended and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed. And what this did was it ended the Mexican-American War in favor of the United States. And it also granted the United States about 525,000 square miles of territory to them, which includes Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. So you can see a great portion of the western part of the United States. Mexico also gave up claims to Texas and recognized the Rio Grande River, which is the river that's on the border of El Paso and Juarez, Mexico. That is a southern boundary that is kind of a natural boundary, where one side of the river is Mexico and one side of the river is the United States. Now, a lot of our other borders are hard borders, which are defined by fencing and territorial lines now. The gold rush also happened. The discovery of gold up in the Sacramento Valley in 1848 brought a lot of people into the United States who are panning for gold, or into California who are. So kind of the lure of quick riches brought people from different parts of the United States into northern part of California. As news spread the discovery, thousands of miners traveled by sea or over to or land to San Francisco and the surrounding areas, especially up in the northern part country. I mean, a part of the country called Eureka, part of the state called Eureka is another area that gold was mined in. And, for those of you that follow football, NFL football, the 49ers, San Francisco 49ers are actually named after these prospectors who went out and extracted about $2 billion worth of precious gold and metal from that area. We also saw the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. In 1862, the Pacific Railroad Act chartered that the Central Pacific Railroad and the Union Pacific Railroad would merge, and they would task them with building a transcontinental railroad or a railroad across the continent of North America or indeed the United States, which would link east to west. And they would have a competition to see who could meet who first, right? So over the next 7 years, the two companies would race toward each other from Sacramento, California on one end and Omaha, Nebraska on the other, struggling against great risk before they met at Promontory, Utah, on May 10th, 1869. So think about this. Why would this benefit citizens? Why would a transcontinental railroad benefit people? We can move merchandise and we can move people, right? So just kind of keep that in mind. That was one of the reasons that, this whole transcontinental railroad was so ambitious, that it was used to move people as well as commerce, and in a quicker time. The Central Pacific was built by Chinese immigrants, numbering more than 50,000, Irish immigrants, as well as Civil War vets and Mexicans helped build the Union Pacific. So we look at our ideology here in the NSF. When we talk about ideology, we talk about political leanings, right? For the most part, California is a really democratic state. There are different areas of California that tend to be a little bit more conservative than others. And I think you can even break it down to areas within San Diego that might be a little bit more liberal than conservative. San Francisco and LA are the a couple of the most liberal cities here in the United States, and even, especially in California. San Diego is maybe something at the midpoint, I would say. Also depending on the area that you live in San Diego, kind of south of the 52 will generally be a little bit more Democratic. North of the 52 up into maybe the 78 would be a little bit more Republican. East County, San Diego, Santee, El Cajon is going to tend to be a little bit more Republican. But there's different parts of the city. And when we look at the Electoral College, we'll look at a really specific map that we could see where there might be points in different parts of the city that voted differently in the presidential election, and we'll look into a little bit more depth on that. Orange County is relatively conservative in some of the affluent areas in Orange County, like Newport Beach or Laguna Hills, some of those places that have a little bit more money that you need to be able to live there. But then again, once you go into Santa Ana and Anaheim, it tends to be a little bit more Democrat. And we'll look at that map when we get toward talking about the Electoral College. Is California problematic? Can California direct democracy cause issues? In some instances, it can, right? The budget, and I kind of neglected to talk about our own House legislature here, our two House legislature. We have a two legislative chambers here in the United States, in California. One is called the Assembly, which is composed of 80 members, and one is composed of the California Senate, which has 40 members. And they represent different areas of the state in Sacramento for us citizens. Here in California, we have 53 representatives in the House. This is going to be changing to, I believe, 52 due to the 2020 census. And we'll talk about redistricting and the single member districts a little bit later in the term. Now, when we talk about California, can direct democracy cause issues? At times it can, and we'll talk about it. But, to keep in mind, when we go into talking about it, remember Madison's tyranny of the majority, there's avenues to help maybe people whose rights are being adversely affected by these direct democracy decisions that are made. And when we talk about direct democracy, these are all decisions that we can make as citizens that affect laws and statutes here in California. Remember, California is a majoritarian state due to our right to direct democracy. So majority is going to rule, but at times you might need a supermajority, which is 66% when we need to raise or lower a tax. Or there are also avenues that groups can take if we have an aspect of tyranny of the majority. So let's take a look at the direct democracy movement here in the progressive movement that happened in the early part of the 20th century. Hiram Johnson was elected governor in 1910. He wanted to limit corruption and restore democratic principles. So he brought direct democracy to the California Constitution in 1911. And this gives us the ability to use something called an initiative, something called a referendum, and something called a recall. And we'll talk about these individually in a minute. But if you look at this map of the United States and you see the yellowed shaded areas, these are states that have direct and indirect initiatives here in the United States. We do not have indirect initiatives here in California. We only have direct initiatives, and we'll talk a little bit of the aspects of that in a minute. But just keep in mind, roughly a little more than half of the states have the ability to petition their state government to either change a law or set up a law or whatever. And we'll talk about that as we go along. Placing an initiative on the ballot here in the United States is relatively easy, right? So keep that in mind. And when we say initiative, you may be a little bit more familiar with another name that they use, and that's called a proposition. So we see propositions that are coming out right now. If you're watching the news or television right now, you might see a lot of commercials for Proposition 26, Proposition 27. Those are initiatives that we'll talk about in a little bit. This has been used a lot of times, especially since 1978, and we'll watch a video about Proposition 13, which was a major initiative that changed the way schools, police, and fire are funded, which limited property tax to 1% of our assessed value. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So like I said, in direct democracy, we have an initiative where a percentage of voters using a petition. So, I mean, many of you probably have gone to a Vons or a Target or something, or a Walmart, and have somebody shove a piece of paper in your face asking you to sign. That is usually a petition to get an initiative on the ballot. Referendums are a little bit different. Referendums are kind of an initiative, but it's promulgated or it's produced by the California legislature, and they want the people to vote on. Doesn't happen that often. So a referendum is where the California Assembly and Senate put out a law, and they want the voters to decide whether or not that law should be enacted. We also have the ability to recall. And what we can do with the recall is we can remove an elected official before his or her term ends. And we'll talk a little bit more of the nuances of that in a little bit. So here in California, we have two types of initiatives. We don't have an indirect initiatives. Both of the initiatives that we have are direct initiatives. The first one is a state constitutional amendment where we as citizens can in a sense, amend our state constitution. The other initiative that we have is a statute initiative where we as citizens can develop a law that will be put into place. If a majority of people want it to be done, we could do that. So remember that state constitutional amendment or a statute, which is basically a law. So there's a couple of things that we need to do in order to get something on the ballot. And one thing that you're going to need is you're going to need money, right? So all you need is $2,000 and an idea. And what you do is you make a down payment or a deposit of that $2,000. Then you circulate your initiative for 150 days. Prior to that, you have to send a full text of the measure or the law to the California Attorney General's Initiative Coordinator with the request for a summary, contact info, signed statement, certifying that proponents are qualified electors, and a $2,000 deposit. Now, one thing to keep in mind is if your proposition qualifies or if your initiative qualifies for the ballot, you get that $2,000 back. But if your proposition does not qualify for the ballot, you lose $2,000. So, you could see it takes money, right? There's going to be a public input period. There must be a 30-day period where the public can review and discuss the initiative and give their input. Proponents are allowed to alter the initiative according to suggestions and discussions that they have with the public. After that, there is a summary that is done by the Attorney General's office. Once proponents have submitted all the required material, the Attorney General must draft a brief 100-word circulating title and summary of the initiative. And then they're given a number. It's not the number that we see on the ballot, but they're given an initiative number. And then the Attorney General has 15 days to complete the petition language. Then once the petition language is completed, then the signature gatherers can go out and start gathering signatures. And one of the things that also has to be reviewed is potential fiscal impact. So how much money is it going to use to pass this initiative, or what effect on the economy is this initiative going to cause? What money is going to be generated? So there has to be a lot that is put into it, and kind of giving the voter flow disclosure of what is going to be on that ballot and what that initiative is going to cost the public. So when we go out for an initiative and get our petition signature, so these are the people at Vaughn's right now that go out and have us sign stuff. You have to be a registered voter to do it, right? So they have to gather X number of voters in the last gubernatorial race in order for an initiative to qualify for the ballot. So there's going to be two criteria that we need, right? So for a constitutional initiative, you need 8% of the number of voters in the last gubernatorial election to approve that measure or to approve that initiative, right? So 8%, that is 997,138 people. For a law or a statute initiative, a statutory initiative, you need 5% or 623,211 people to sign that petition. So just remember those numbers, wink, wink, hint, hint. Know the differences in the numbers between the constitutional initiative that is needed in a petition and the statutory initiative criteria that is needed in position. Constitutional initiative, 8%. Statutory initiative, 5%. So generally you need a lot of money to be able to qualify an initiative on the ballot and to run your election. News spots are expensive. Having staff paying petition gatherers, petition signer gatherers are expensive. So without about $1 to $2 million, you can't really get anything on the ballot. You need money or capital to help pay people. If you have that money, you could practically get anything on the ballot, no matter how wacky. Proposition 6, which was attempted in 1998 and passed, it was the prohibition of horse slaughter and sale of horse meat for human consumption. So that's something that's illegal here in California. Once you get all your signatures, each local registrar of voters will confirm that the people that signed the petition are able to sign the petition. So they'll do a random sampling to see how many people are able to sign that petition. So they'll maybe check every 50 signature, every 100 signature. Now, there are instances where a full count signature can be requested, where they check everybody's signature, or they verify everybody's signature, but obviously that's going to take a lot of time. So just kind of keep that in mind. If you want to raise a tax or start a new tax, if it is a referendum or initiative that is proposed by the government, you need 66% of voters to approve it in order to raise a tax, to create a new tax, or even to eliminate a tax. That's a very hard number to get to. We'll talk about the Charger Stadium issue in a little bit. If proposed by a citizen, only 51% needs to be accomplished. And that was kind of out of what came out of the Charger Stadium issue in 2016, where the original criteria needed was 66%, and then there was some litigation, and they decided that if a citizen proposes a new tax, raising of a tax, or eliminating of a tax, you only need 51% of the population to vote for it. So let's look at some controversial proposition or initiatives that we've seen here in California, in the United States. Proposition 13, and we'll have a video to watch about Proposition 13. This limit property tax to 1% of your assessed value. Prior to Prop 13, your property tax was 3% of your assessed value. So if your home was worth $100,000 in 1978, you would pay $3,000 in taxes. Prop 13 capped that to 1%. So after Prop 13 went in effect, your property tax was now and still is 1% of your assessed value. So if your home was $100,000 in 1978, your property tax would only be $1,000. So you can right away see that there's going to be a revenue gap between this, because you're lowering the amount of revenue that is coming in, and it had a really negative effect on schools, fire departments, police departments, and public services. I think if we were all together, maybe in a class, we could discuss some of the things that we would have wanted in the K through 12 schools, things that are that lack funding, like some sports or maybe some extracurricular activities. A lot of it came as a result of lowering the threshold for property tax, because you're cutting into tax revenue that was going to schools, fire, police, and public services. And in the video, there's going to be a really good kind of discussion about it. So I want you to really pay attention to it. And it kind of tells the story about Howard Jarvis and how he worked to get this proposition passed, with some of his thinking with regards to, maybe we don't need to fund schools or fire departments or police departments as much as we do. It passed with 62% of the vote. Each tax recipient lost funding. California went from first in the nation in education in the 60s to 48th after the passage of Prop 13, sorry. So you can see a lot of money. They lost $3 billion overnight. So a third of that, their usual budget, was kind of wiped away. Proposition 8 is another controversial proposition. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the Supreme Court portion. But what Proposition 8 was, it was a constitutional amendment that was attempted to be passed, where it would define marriage to be a relationship between a man and a woman only. It was passed with 52% of the vote. This was later challenged in court cases that we'll talk about down the road when we talk about the legalization of same-sex marriage. But at one time, when Proposition 8 was passed, it was passed with 52% of the vote here in California. So I think, and this happened in 2008. So I think, maybe people might not have known what they're really voting for. It was called the Civil Rights Initiative and Family Initiative. So I think people might have gotten confused by some of the things that, some of the rhetoric that was put into place. But remember, we talked about Madison and the tyranny of the majority. So we see the majority here wanting something passed that was adversely affecting the rights of a minority group. and people in a minority class. So obviously, to prevent tyranny in the majority, there's avenues such as the courts that these same-sex couples were able to use in order to legalize same-sex marriage. And we'll definitely talk about that down the road. Here in San Diego, one of the more controversial propositions in the past 10 years was whether or not we wanted to build the Chargers a new stadium and expand our convention center here in San Diego. It would cost $1.8 billion, would raise hotel tax from 12.5% to 16.5%, and the city would contribute $1.1 billion to build the project. The Chargers would contribute 300 million, and the NFL would contribute 350 million. Now, some of the things that is, if we look at the pros and cons of this, the city would be able to attract Super Bowls. Super Bowl, the Super Bowl officials really find San Diego to be an attractive destination for the Super Bowl due to the weather in January and February, due to the cities, kind of the way things are built, the amount of hotels that we have here. And they had said that if we would have a new stadium here, that we would be in a Super Bowl rotation where the Super Bowl would be in San Diego every 4 years. And the Super Bowl usually generates about $350 million in revenue for the city, whether it's sales tax, hotel tax, people going out and spending money. Another thing was Final Fours generally generates about $300 million for the city. I did some looking, and wrestling generates about $150 million for a city. It would create jobs. We would need to expand the convention center as well. And every July we have Comic-Con. Comic-Con comes here to San Diego, and they generate about $700 million in that weekend in revenue. And I don't know if any of you have been to Comic-Con, but it's definitely outgrown the convention center that we have here. And I think it would be wise to expand the convention center just to accommodate that, and look how much money it takes in. Now we look at the cons. At the time, only citizens of our residents of the city of San Diego could vote on this. Should we be giving billionaires welfare? I mean, the Spanos family were billionaires. And should we, as a city, give them $1.1 billion to build a stadium? Another thing is, if there's cost overruns, the city would have been on the hook for that, which actually happened in LA at the new SoFi Stadium, where I think with some rains that happened, and also the pandemic, it delayed the opening of the stadium and cost a couple of more $1 billion for that stadium to be built, which is actually an incredible stadium. I've been to it, and it's really, really nice and wide and vast, and then very impressive. But you could tell that a lot of money was spent there. Are other things more important, like public parks or libraries? And at that time, you needed a supermajority, the 66% to vote. So it barely got about 43%. So it didn't really come close to passing. So kind of, the Chargers would eventually move to LA. Comic-Con can technically still move to LA. San Diego, I believe, has a contract with Comic-Con through 2024. But, there's that area up in LA where they're trying to build, the new Clippers arena, SoFi Stadium, all of that up there. And it might be a very attractive place for the Comic-Con organizers to move. So, it's just something that we need to consider. Now, referendum is a little bit different. A referendum is a constitutional amendment that's put forth on the ballot by the Assembly and the Senate for us to vote on. There's some links you can click here, and you can see just by clicking the links when you get a chance. I'm not going to bring it up. When you get a chance, you'll see that the referendum doesn't happen that often. Now, the recall is a power that we have where we can recall an elected official. This could be any state officer or also any local officer, whether it's a governor, lieutenant governor, or secretary of state. The state constitution requires the legislator must provide for the recall of local officers. So we'll talk about that. And we have some examples here. Governor Gray Davis in the early 2000s was recalled from office, led to the election of Arnold Schwarzenegger. There were some concerns about energy usage here in California taxes. We would get something called rolling blackouts at times where you couldn't use your electricity. So a lot of people had a lot of disdain for Governor Davis, and it led to the election of Arnold Schwarzenegger. There was an attempt to recall Judge Aaron Persky, who was the judge that presided in the Brock Turner case. I'm not going to go into a lot of details about the Brock Turner case because it's really infuriating when you look at it. And some of you might be familiar with it, so take a look if you're not. But that judge that made the decision in the Brock Turner case was actually recalled from office in June of 2018. And then more recently, we saw an attempt to remove Governor Gavin Newsom from office, where we had questions about, how the pandemic was being handled, business closures, mask mandates. And when we had the recall vote that was done on September 14, 2021, 62% of the people chose to keep Newsom in office. So basically, in order to recall an elected official, you need to get a petition of 12% of voters in that last office. So if it's a governor office, you will need 12% of the total number of people that voted in the gubernatorial election in the prior term. And you have to have signatures from people from at least 5 different counties. And there's also, some charters here in different cities have ways that you can recall officials. What we'll do next on this video is we'll look at the propositions that are going to be happening in November of 2022, and we'll take a look at those and we'll see what we're going to be voting on coming up. All right, we will do that in a little bit.